It begins at the hour when the world is unguarded, when your apartment is a quiet ache and the shadows in the hallway are the only things that move. You wake before the alarm, with that familiar pressure under the sternum, as if a messenger knocked in the night and left a sealed letter on your ribs. Shoes wait by the bed in mute complicity. You slip them on not because you love the pavement, but because stillness is a mouth that will finally say your name. You run because to stay would be to hear it. You run because the floorboards creak like old truths. You run because it feels safer to be breathless than to be honest. You tell yourself you're getting fit, optimizing, building momentum. But the truth is simpler and unsentimental. Motion is your alibi, and your refuge is the rhythm of flight. At the edge of the park, the city is a dim geometry. Benches like small altars to ordinary grief, lamplight trembling as though everything is temporarily assembled. Your pulse becomes a drum you try to outrun. The paradox arrives with your breath. The faster you move, the closer something catches up. The more you blur the scenery, the clearer that voice becomes. You turn up music to outrun the music of your own head. You count steps to bury the questions that have learned to count you. You tell yourself you are escaping a threat. What if the escape is the threat? What if your velocity is the lock on the door you think you're opening? You know the choreography by heart. Take on an extra project so you don't have to sit in the quiet after work. Say yes to drinks you don't want so you can drink something stronger than the silence. Fill the calendar like sandbags against a flood that never comes and somehow always does. You cycle through micro-escapes that look like habits, like snacks, like scrolling, like sarcasm. Each a tiny corridor that leads back to the same room with the same unblinking mirror. You keep the world loud so your mind can be a crowded room where the only person not invited is you. But beneath the fanfare of productivity and companionship, there is a different drumbeat, a secret migration of meaning away from the center of your life. You sense it each time a compliment lands and evaporates, each time you achieve something that becomes dust in your mouth. You sense it each time joy feels like contraband and rest feels like trespassing. Maybe there was a season when you thought the world would reward your speed. Hustle was holy and your calendar a liturgy. The more you ascended the ladder, the more the rung beneath you vibrated with the unease you refused to name. What does it mean to be ambitious if you cannot stand the person doing the climbing? What does it mean to be loved when no one has yet found where you are hiding? You curate yourself as if you were a museum, velvet ropes around the exhibits you permit others to see, carefully staged lighting on strength, humor, resilience, while the closed wing, regret, envy, confusion, stays locked for maintenance indefinitely. You are both the curator and the guard, both the visitor and the contraband, both the messenger and the sealed letter. Here is the contradiction you dare not settle with. You say you want freedom, yet you define freedom as having more exits. You multiply versions of yourself like keys on a ring. One for work, one for family, one for strangers, one for nights when you are not yourself, because you never feel like yourself anyway. Freedom becomes the promise of leaving before you arrive. But there's a quiet intelligence in your body that refuses the bargain. Heart rate spikes when nothing outside is wrong. Stomach tightens when kindness is offered. Jaw clenches while watching a sunset because beauty loosens the trap door under the secret you've sworn not to look at. The more you anesthetize, the louder the pain must scream to be heard. The more you insist you are fine, the more every object in your life begins to shout, "Liar," in the softest possible voice. How long can a person perform self-abandonment before their reflection refuses to participate? You call it stress. You call it a busy season. You call it needing a win. You call it miscommunication. You call it anything but the thing with your name stitched on it. You have learned to get better at not feeling. You have trained in it like a discipline, set PRs in avoidance, won medals in heroic distraction. But something irreducible keeps placing a chair in the center of the room and inviting you to sit. You see this chair in the eyes of a friend who asks how you really are, in the inconvenient honesty of a child's question, in the way your breath catches when you read a sentence you didn't expect to understand so personally. These moments are small detonations of truth. They blow holes in your timeline and force you to notice that the present is not a bridge. It is the only room with oxygen. Still you sprint across it pretending it is merely a hallway. Is it possible that the monster behind you is actually the animal you've tied up in the attic of your own life? The one skilled in sensing weather and danger? The one whose instincts you have pathologized because they do not look good on a resume? So the question that begins to gnaw at you is simple and treacherous. Who would you be if you stopped running? Not the polished answer, not the noble slogan, not the aspirational vignette, but the raw reply you avoid like a creditor. If you sat with the unpayable debt of unlived days, what would it ask of you? If you turned around in the corridor of avoidance, right now, sweaty and unprepared, what would you see sprinting toward you with your own face? Could you bear the intimacy of unedited attention? Could you tolerate becoming legible to yourself? Could you risk making a home in the place you've only ever visited as a trespasser? There is a man standing on the far shore of your life, and he looks suspiciously like you without the disguise. He is not a fantasy of perfection. He is simply the one who stopped running. He is waiting, not impatient, not smug, simply present with a patience that unnerves you because it suggests the chase has always been optional, and the leash has always been in your hand. If you sense this tension gathering under your daily motions, then you have already begun. The next step is not another step at all, but a turn. To understand what you're running from, you must learn how the running was built. By memory, by culture, by story, by the unspoken contracts you signed with survival. We'll trace the hidden architecture of this flight and the roots that feed it so stubbornly. Stay with this inquiry. Share it with someone who runs, and if this conversation is the kind you want more of, support this channel by subscribing so the community of courageous listeners grows. Because what comes next will politely dismantle the alibis you've mistaken for a life. If the running felt inevitable, it's because it was engineered long before you chose it. Survival drafted the blueprints. You didn't wake one morning and decide to exile yourself from yourself. You inherited a choreography that once kept you safe. Picture the first time you learned the cost of being fully visible. It might have been small, an eye roll when you were excited, a door shut after you cried, a parent who loved you but was too flooded to meet what you felt. An early equation formed in the basement of your nervous system. Less of me equals more acceptance. More of me equals danger. From then on, you practiced an art that won you medals in adaptation. You learned how to edit, to modulate, to offer a version of you that traveled well in the weather of other people's moods. Winnicott would call this the false self, a clever, elegant scaffold erected to protect the tender architecture of the true one. You didn't betray yourself. You quarantined your essence until the environment could bear it. It just never felt safe enough to unlock the door again. Attachment theory gives the running a map. Bowlby whispers that when care is inconsistent or misattuned, a child becomes an exquisite meteorologist. You read the barometer of faces and tilt your internal climate accordingly. If closeness feels haunted by disappointment, you deactivate. If distance feels like annihilation, you hyperactivate. Either way, you tilt away from your own interior weather toward a forecast you can better control. Down the years, this becomes a personality trait that reads like independence or charming overfunctioning. Underneath it is an oath. I will not need what cannot be guaranteed. That oath is the engine under your steps. It hums at work when you over-prepare to avoid the hot breath of shame. It hums in conversation when you steer the topic away from anything that would require your heart to appear without makeup. It hums in your corridors of busyness the way you sell your exhaustion as virtue because exhaustion disguises fear as devotion. Freud would recognize your sprint as a defense. Repression tucks away what threatens the representable order. Rationalization writes the memoir that flatters your most frightened choices. Reaction formation lets you preach what you cannot practice without trembling. The superego, internalized, severe, wearing the voice of those whose approval you still hope will save you, doesn't ask you to rest. It demands that you be better, faster, smarter, kinder, more efficient, and, for the love of all that is holy, less ambivalent. The paradox worsens when culture adopts the superego's dialect. Zizek notes the cruel injunction of our time is not merely work, but enjoy. And perform your enjoyment conspicuously. Be authentic, but make it marketable. Be vulnerable, but tidy. Be free, but measurable. You learn to run with a smile, to turn anxiety into content, to transform longing into a productivity hack. Your avoidance receives applause. Jung would place a hand on the locked wing of your museum and say, "Here lives the shadow." Not evil, not monstrous, simply the disowned portion of your wholeness. What you could not integrate, you projected on others. The lazy colleague, the needy friend, the arrogant stranger. The more you exile these qualities, the more energy it takes to patrol the borders of your identity. What you resist not only persists, as he's often paraphrased, it grows teeth. Each patrol requires movement. Each movement becomes the proof you are safer when you are not still. Kierkegaard names the running despair, the refusal to be the self you are, or the attempt to be the self you are not. He calls it the sickness unto death, and you can feel its fevers in the oscillation between grand plans and quiet collapses. Heidegger would point to your absorption in Das Man, the anonymous they, that dictates how a life should look. In everydayness, you become busy with talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. You live at the surface, not because you are shallow, but because depth smuggles the scent of that original dissonance. Sartre calls it bad faith when you treat your freedom as if it were an external destiny. When you play the role so well you forget you ever auditioned. You convince yourself that you are the job title, the carefully curated timeline, the laugh in the crowded room. You become the waiter so convincingly that the role devours the person who once chose it. Society reinforces the flight in ways that feel like care. Productivity culture baptizes your avoidance with compliments. Markets train you to become an entrepreneur of the self, optimizing not only your work but your personality, friendships, even your grief. Goffman mapped the stage, and you have the costumes to prove it. Social media is the mirror stage reenacted every morning. Lacan would say your image coherence depends on a gaze that can never fully confirm you. You chase likes as if they were breadcrumbs back to yourself, but the forest grows. Cooley's looking glass self teaches that you become what you think others think of you, and the algorithm ensures you always know what the crowd is thinking. Behold the labyrinth. There is no minotaur. There is only you in costumes, you in flight, you in split scenes, you doubling back on yourself because one more corridor might end in a door that leads home. Underneath the theater, there is a nervous system negotiating with reality. Neuroscience does not accuse you, it explains you. When your amygdala memorizes danger, it rings alarms at the slightest resonance. Your prefrontal cortex, tasked with calm analysis, becomes a hostage of ancient sirens. The default mode network, our narrative weaver, stitches a self out of memory. If the thread was dyed in shame, the garment it makes fits like a hair shirt. So you switch to the task-positive network, the salvation of busyness, because tasks quiet the narrator. The relief is genuine, but neither network can answer the question you refuse to ask. Interoception, the sense of your internal state, degrades when you ignore it. You stop registering the early signals, so your body learns to shout. Panic looks like a surprise only because you were not attending to the whispers. Over time, your window of tolerance narrows and the world seems louder, crueler, less negotiable. Not because it has changed, but because the bridge to your own signals has eroded. Cognitive biases conspire politely. Confirmation bias finds evidence that activity means safety. Present bias makes deferred pain someone else's problem, namely, you, tomorrow. The ostrich effect rewards you for not looking at the bank account of your inner life. Whatever you do not check cannot convict you. The sunk cost fallacy whispers, "You've been this person so long, it would be wasteful to change." Scarcity mindset insists there's not enough time to feel, that if you stop for even a minute you will miss the train whose destination you never verify. Hedonic adaptation numbs the spikes of joy until you need louder and rarer stimuli just to feel the baseline. Each bias is a minor god of motion. Together they preach a liturgy of acceleration. Language joins the conspiracy. You say, "I'm fine," so often it becomes a talisman. You narrate your life as a series of projects because projects confer a clarity that bodies and souls refuse. You adopt metaphors of war for your mornings and metaphors of conquest for your evenings. Under the banner of self-improvement, you smuggle in self-doubt, and the more beautifully you describe your struggle, the more license you grant it to stay. Because you are articulate, because you are sensitive, because you can name the problem with rare precision, you mistake poetry for resolution. Words can open doors. They can also paint them so convincingly you forget to try the knob. So the hidden problem is not that you are weak or lazy or somehow broken beyond repair. The hidden problem is that you are competent at surviving an environment that no longer exists. The signal never switched to safe, so you never updated the policy. You are running a legacy code of self-protection on a life that could, with care, sustain presence. But before you rewrite, you must see the true cost of keeping the program. Not the obvious weariness or the social inconveniences. The deeper cost. The collateral damage you've normalized because it accumulates in quiet corners and polite conversations. That is where we go next. To the unseen consequences. The slow architecture of loss that builds in the background while you collect trophies in the foreground. If this resonates, share it with the one person who knows your sprint, leave a comment about where you learned to run, and subscribe so this channel remains a gathering place for those practicing the art of turning around. Because to face the cost is to begin to reclaim the currency of your life. The costs do not announce themselves with alarms. They accumulate like sediment in a riverbed until the current changes without your consent. At first it is small. You forget what you were about to say in a conversation that matters. You wake at 3 in the morning with a full mind and an empty explanation. You laugh at a joke you don't find funny because silence feels riskier than complicity. You start to avoid mirrors except for the utilitarian moments of grooming. Your playlists get louder even as your joy gets quieter. You call this aging or schedule or circumstance, but what it is, in part, is the interest charged on the debt of self-avoidance. And the compound rate is astonishing. Physiology keeps the books long after you stop checking the ledger. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis doesn't believe your calendar. It believes your posture and your breath. Chronic activation becomes allostatic load, a slow tax on immunity, digestion, even memory. Cortisol is a loyal soldier in a war that has no battlefield, so it keeps policing your bloodstream as if the next email were a tiger. Sleep becomes efficient and unrefreshing, a series of shallow treaties rather than restorative peace. Micro-inflammations bloom like invisible bruises. The body, asked to sprint without a destination, begins to mistake every road for an exit ramp. You feel it in the ache behind the eyes, the new allergy, the way hunger and fullness become unreliable narrators. Interoception dims, so you respond to your life like a pilot whose instruments flicker. And because the story you tell yourself still centers on competence, you interpret these malfunctions as further reasons to accelerate. Proof that you have not yet earned rest. The nervous system does not care about your self-concept. It cares about safety. Your default mode network, the narrator-in-chief, keeps knitting a story that preserves continuity. If it learned early that, I am okay when I am not here, it will shape attention to uphold the covenant. Meanwhile, the salience network becomes jumpy, prioritizing threats to the social self over signals from the inner one. The brain is plastic. It lays down highways where you drive most often. Avoidance becomes a superhighway, lit by neon promises of relief. Presence becomes a narrow footpath overgrown with doubt. With time, the path you don't take starts to disappear. Not because it is gone, but because you have forgotten the way back. Relationships register the toll like seismographs picking up tremors before the quake. Intimacy becomes a negotiation not of closeness, but of what will be kept off limits. You become deft at steering conversations to safe shallows, a sailor who never leaves sight of shore because the ocean looks like a verdict. Partners feel it first as confusion. Why do you go quiet right when it matters? Friends sense it as unpredictability. Why do you disappear after promising to come? Children sense it as weather. They cannot name it, but they organize their small worlds around the fronts and pressures of your mood. The home becomes a place where certain doors never open, and the air grows stale in the locked rooms. You call it privacy. You call it strength. They call it distance. And distance, like cold, can look like clarity until your teeth begin to chatter. Work flatters your running with applause you cannot metabolize. You are reliable, a problem solver, the one who says, I'll handle it with a calm that hides the cost. But creativity shrinks when fear of exposure is the primary architect. Originality requires pause, meandering, failure without humiliation. The sprinting self cannot afford these luxuries, so you recycle excellence. You become a master of near-duplicate brilliance, polished, safe, praised, and haunted by a rumor that you are capable of something you cannot prove because the proof would require stillness. Ethical compromises arrive in friendly clothing. You overcommit and underpresence. You keep a silence you justify as diplomacy. The boundary you don't set becomes a resentment you carry, and resentment is a debt that compounds with interest and corrodes the vault where your integrity should rest. Culture rewards your compliance with its anxious tempo. The algorithm, designed on a variable ratio schedule that would impress Skinner, trains your nervous system to crave the next ping because intermittent rewards shape behavior most reliably. The illusion of truth effect makes repetition sound like wisdom. Scroll long enough and you start to believe the motto that everything you want is on the far side of one more grind. The false consensus effect convinces you that everyone is as busy, as numb, as performatively fine as you, so there is comfort in the crowd. Status quo bias whispers that change is riskier than the erosion you know. The availability heuristic makes the stories of spectacular burnouts more salient than the quiet recoveries, so you keep telling yourself you're not that bad. And the ostrich effect helps you keep eyes off the dashboards that would contradict your narrative. Then there is the shadow economy of comparison, where you pay with envy for goods that cannot be delivered. Social feeds are a museum of finished products. Your life is an unending workshop. The discrepancy becomes a phantom pain. The Dunning-Kruger effect slides in backstage, not to make you overestimate skill, but to make you misjudge how deeply your avoidance infiltrates the texture of your days. Planning fallacy keeps you believing that next week will be different, that the calendar that defeated 20 previous intentions will relent this time. Sunk cost fallacy enforces loyalty to identities you have outgrown. The IKEA effect makes you overvalue the elaborate scaffolds of coping you built. Because you constructed them by hand, dismantling them feels like heresy. Each bias adds friction to the act of turning around. And friction, multiplied by time, becomes a wall. The spiritual consequence is harder to name without sounding melodramatic, but it is the center of the storm. Nietzsche warned that fighting monsters can turn you into one. He was not moralizing, he was describing a physics of attention. What you treat as enemy becomes your master. You become addicted to a particular mood, to an undertone of urgency that feels like purpose. Kierkegaard's despair becomes lifestyle. Camus's Sisyphus gets a smartwatch and optimizes his hill. You become efficient at rolling the boulder because the boulder is an object and objects obey. Meaning, by contrast, resists control. It arrives when you stop arranging the furniture and begin to ask who lives in the house. In your quietest hours, a different dread creeps in, one that does not shout but beckons. It is the weight of the unlived life, what Jung called the shadow of potential. It has a scent, cedar and rain, old books and clean sheets. It speaks softly enough that you need a different kind of ear to hear it, and hearing it would require staying. Society bears the collateral damage of our collective sprint. Public discourse becomes a theater of projection. What we cannot contain privately, we shout across the aisle. Outrage offers a quick clarity. It burns away nuance and replaces it with a righteousness that stabilizes the self briefly. Polarization pays well in the attention economy. The commons, where patience, curiosity, and repair are cultivated, shrinks. Consumer culture offers consolation prizes, and we accept them because they are easier than grief. We buy a new tool to solve an old ache. We gamify our habits, quantify our sleep, track our gratitude like it were a marketing metric. None of these are bad. Their trouble is instrumentalization. When everything becomes a means, you lose sight of ends, and ends require a self who can say, "This is what I love," without a spreadsheet. All the while, time performs its definitive magic trick. It pretends to be abundant and then, without malice, becomes memory. You bank on after the promotion, once the kids are older, when things settle down. Things rarely settle. They just change shape. Mortality is not a threat meant to scare you into compliance. It is a constraint that can concentrate the heart. But running blurs mortality into a distant weather report. The cost is easy to summarize and impossible to repay without tenderness. You begin to feel like a beautifully maintained house with a half-packed suitcase by the door, ready for a departure you never schedule and a homecoming you never allow. If this sounds severe, it is only because the trap is quiet and polite. You do not need a catastrophe to prove it exists. The catastrophe is that you might never have one dramatic enough to force a reckoning. You will simply become intensely competent at the management of absence. And yet something in you objects. You notice how grief appears when music gets soft. You notice the flutter of relief when you forget for a minute to pretend. You notice that kindness hits you like weather. These are not weaknesses. They are leakages of truth from the sealed room. They suggest that a different way of moving is possible, a way that refuses the old bargain. We are near the inflection point, but we will not steal the revelation from the work it requires. The breakthrough is not a trick, not another productivity hack dressed in spiritual clothing. It will violate the training that made your sprint feel noble. It will ask you to invert the direction of your gaze and the definition of safety. It will feel like stepping off a treadmill that everyone else calls a road, and it will confirm a suspicion you have long entertained in secret, that the door has never been locked from the inside. If this journey resonates, share it with the person whose sprint you recognize. Leave a comment naming one consequence you refuse to normalize and subscribe, so this channel remains a place where difficult truths are spoken gently. In the next chapter, we will explore how to break free, counterintuitive moves, historical companions, and practices that will feel at once like rebellion and homecoming. Stay with me, because what comes next will give your courage something precise to do. The first move feels indecent to the sprinting self. You stop, not collapse, not revenge sleep, not sedation disguised as rest, but a deliberate halt that looks like treason to your training. Stillness is not the absence of action. It is the original action from which all coherent movement derives. You have been outsourcing safety to speed. You will now relocate safety to presence. Safety, it turns out, is not the absence of threat, but the presence of self. This is the radical shift. You do not become brave by numbing fear. You become brave by staying with the body that feels it, and refusing to interpret your sensations as verdicts. Begin with the allegiance that changes everything. Treat the runner not as an enemy, but as a loyal guard who never got the memo that the war ended. This part of you once saved your life, psychically, relationally, perhaps literally, by moving you away from overwhelm when you were too small to metabolize it. The runner deserves gratitude before guidance. So you make a strange appointment with yourself. Sit in the chair you've been avoiding. Ask out loud if you dare, what are you protecting me from? Wait long enough to hear something other than your own impatience. Internal family systems calls these parts. Freud called them compromises. James called them habits of mind. The names matter less than the posture. You are not pathologizing your defenses. You are thanking them for their service and renegotiating their contract. You don't have to run as fast anymore, you say to the runner. You get to stand at the gate and ring the bell when there is real danger. I will come. This is not sentimentality. It is strategy. Gratitude disarms resistance because the nervous system does not yield under attack. It yields when it senses collaboration. Build a practice small enough to evade the perfectionism that ruins beginnings. 2 minutes. Timer on the table. Back supported. Feet grounded. Eyes soft. Exhale longer than you inhale. 4 counts in, 6 counts out, to nudge your vagus nerve toward parasympathetic calm. Polyvagal theory isn't a magic spell, but it is a map. The body needs signals of safety before the psyche can unmask. Then name what you feel without narrative. 3 sensations, 3 emotions, 3 thoughts. Warmth in chest, buzz in jaw, heaviness in stomach, sadness, irritation, relief. This is dumb. I'm busy. Keep going. Affect labeling, as Lieberman showed, reduces amygdala reactivity by giving the storm a weather report. You are not solving yourself. You are turning toward. 2 minutes becomes 3, then 5. Stillness is a muscle. You train it the way you trained avoidance. Repetition, gentle escalation, consistency. The first victories will be boring. Celebrate them anyway. Boredom is often the grief of a nervous system weaning off adrenaline. Design your environment like Odysseus designed his voyage past the sirens. He did not trust willpower alone. He tied himself to the mast and filled his sailors' ears with wax. Do the same with your temptations. Silence non-essential notifications. Turn your phone grayscale. Exile dopamine casinos, news, social feeds, email from your first hour awake. Create a sanctuary zone in your home where no screens enter. Place a chair facing a window and nothing else. Call it the listening post and visit it daily. You are not moralizing technology. You are rerouting a variable ratio reinforcement schedule that hijacked your attention. Freedom is not abstinence. It is architecture. Make running inconvenient and presence frictionless. Prepare the space, the time, the objects that make pausing feel like completion rather than interruption. Shift your language because language shifts physiology. Replace should with choose or decline and watch your spine respond. I should meditate becomes I choose 2 minutes to breathe, or I decline today and accept the cost. This is not semantic play. It restores agency. Replace I don't have time with I am prioritizing X over Y, which may sting. But truth is an antiseptic that heals what politeness infects. When the runner insists, we will be abandoned, don't debate. Ask, how will we protect ourselves if we are? Fear becomes less omnipotent when contingency plans exist. Stoics did this with premeditatio malorum, rehearsing misfortune not to invite it, but to defang it. Viktor Frankl etched the same insight into modern therapy. Between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is your power. You are not an effect in search of a cause. You are a cause deciding its effects. Practice relational courage in microdoses. Do not perform vulnerability. Practice it with one person who has earned your truth. Make a small, unfavorable disclosure that won't implode your life, but will stretch your honesty. I said yes because I was afraid to disappoint you. I've been busy as a way to avoid feeling lonely. I'm proud of this project and also ashamed of how much I tied my worth to it. Then breathe as the room fails to cave in. Audre Lorde warned that your silence will not protect you. Real conversation proves it. Boundaries belong here too, and they will feel like betrayal until they become relief. No is a kindness if it prevents you from offering a resentful yes later. Paradoxically, boundaries create closeness because they make contact honest. You cannot be chosen if you are not visible. You cannot be loved if you are not there. Study your triggers the way an artisan studies materials. Where do you accelerate by reflex? Which tasks, rooms, faces, times of day cue flight? Track them for a week without judgment. You are gathering intelligence for a rebellion. Then run opposite action experiments from dialectical behavior therapy. If the urge is to fill silence with explanation, wait 3 breaths and answer simply. If the urge is to say yes immediately, say, I'll get back to you, and check your body before replying. If the urge is to scroll when discomfort arises, place your phone in a different room and drink a glass of water. These are not punishments. They are rehearsals of freedom. Each successful microdefection writes a new line of code. The experiment is to discover that nothing explodes when you don't obey the old rule, except perhaps the illusion that you had no choice. Invite your shadow to work for you. Jung's point was not to exalt the dark, but to reclaim disowned energy and aim it well. You envy the colleague's boldness. Good. Envy is a map of your latent desire. Translate it into a small act. Email the person you've been avoiding, pitch the idea, ask the question that risks a no. You judge the friend's neediness. Good. It points to the tenderness you exiled. Offer yourself a small need and meet it without apology. Then notice how your judgment softens. Shadow integration is not a mystical rite. It is a series of precise embodied moves that return your exiled capacities to the sovereign of your life. You. Honor grief, not as drama, but as maintenance. Every time you stop running, a backlog of mourning arrives. Relationships you inhabited at a slant, selves you abandoned to play roles, opportunities lost to the sprint. Kristen Neff calls it backdraft, when self-compassion stings at first. It is the wound's way of remembering. Schedule grief like a responsible adult schedules taxes. 15 minutes, once a week. Play the song you avoid. Look at the photo you keep face down. Write a letter from the you who ran to the you who waited and let them speak until the words get simple. Grief aerates the soil where your life will grow. Without it, you plant in concrete. Reclaim ritual because ritual tethers intention to matter. A weekly Sabbath of attention. No buying, no selling, no optimizing, no improving. Just being, walking, cooking, reading, noticing. The medieval monastics had a phrase, "The cell will teach you everything." Your cell can be a room, a bench, a path you walk without headphones. Simone Weil called attention the purest form of generosity. Practice attention as a gift you give what you love. If you don't know what you love yet, attend anyway. Love grows where attention rests. And attention withers where it is always rented out for a quick return. Return to first principles. What is a good day? Not in theory, but in your blood. 3 non-negotiables that make you feel like you were there for your life. Perhaps it's sweat, a meaningful conversation, and an hour with a book. Or a walk, a meal you cooked, and a call to your mother. Measure days by presence metrics, not output. Did I turn toward at least once when I wanted to run? Did I tell one truth I usually edit? Did I notice my breath while doing something I love? These are not small. They are revolutionary because they defy the market's metrics and offer your nervous system something it trusts: consistency, coherence, care. Let history recruit your courage. Socrates could have fled. He stayed and said yes to a principle larger than one lifespan. Augustine confessed not as spectacle but as method. The soul becomes legible to itself by telling the truth in public. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire and still wrote at night to discipline his attention toward what he could control: perception, action, will. Gandhi slowed, fasted, withdrew from the noise to amplify moral pressure without violence. These are not saints for imitation. They are companions across time whispering the same proposition. To stop running is not to surrender. It is to place your life in alignment with your deepest commitments and let action arise from there. Expect turbulence and build for it. When stillness reveals how tired you are, do not interpret fatigue as failure. It is data. When panic arrives because the body associates slowing down with danger, keep the exhale long and the eyes soft. Orient to the room. 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear. Tell the runner, yes, I feel it too, and we are safe enough. Safety enough is all you need. The window of tolerance widens with patient practice. If you cannot do this alone, recruit a therapist trained in trauma-informed work. There is no award for solitary heroics. Healing is a team sport. Do not wait for belief to start. Let practice produce belief. The paradox is delicious. You will not think your way into stillness. You will still your way into new thinking. With each small rebellion against the sprint, you will begin to suspect a truth that the old self cannot metabolize. That your worth was never a wage paid for speed. That intimacy is not a prize for perfection. That the man on the far shore is not an aspirational hologram, but the one who has been waving you in with a patience that is almost unbearable. There is a final realization waiting, the kind that reorders your map and renders whole years legible in a new light. We are close. In the last movement, we will name that realization, the one that makes the chase suddenly absurd and the present exquisitely urgent. If this work resonates, share this with someone practicing their own turn. Comment with the small ritual you are willing to try this week, and subscribe so this channel remains a place where depth is not a luxury, but a way of life. Stay with me, because what comes next is the key you have been carrying all along. You stop on an ordinary morning as the city unrolls its routines, and the silence that follows is not empty. It is populated with everything you've refused to host. You turn, slowly, as if a ritual were hidden in the movement. And there he is again, the man on the far shore, except there is no water between you now. He is not older or younger, not better groomed or more enlightened. He is simply not moving. He regards you with a patience that is not condescension but recognition. You expect a test or a sermon. What arrives is simpler. He steps closer until there is no optical trick left, and you register the ordinary miracle. He is you, unedited. The realization does not strike like lightning. It settles like weather. The chase ends not in conquest but in consent. You do not catch the self, you agree to be it. This is the pivot that renders years legible. Identity is not a thing you possess or a mask you perfect. It is a relationship you keep, a living covenant to remain with your experience without exiling the parts that embarrass your image. Psychoanalysis called it developing an observing ego, the capacity to witness your impulses without being abducted by them. Phenomenology called it returning to the things themselves, which in this case means your breath, your grief, your quiet joy. Neuroscience describes it as integration, the prefrontal cortex gently coordinating the orchestra so no single instrument dominates the song. Attachment theory calls it earned security, the adult self becoming the reliable caregiver you once needed. Philosophy, with its many dialects, condenses into one statement you can carry in your pocket. Home is a function you perform, not a location you reach. The paradox sharpens and then liberates. You spent years trying to become acceptable so you could finally rest. The resting was the only road to acceptability that mattered to your nervous system. You tried to manufacture authenticity through performance. Authenticity is a byproduct of presence. You treated peace as a prize for excellence. Peace is the soil from which excellence grows. Carl Rogers named this with elegant audacity when he said that only when he accepted himself did change become possible. Acceptance is not the endpoint of growth, it is the precondition for it. You do not negotiate with reality, you meet it. And the meeting is transformative because the part of you doing the meeting is no longer a frightened envoy sent to impress. It is the host opening the door. What becomes of the runner? He does not die or disappear. He hands you the keys he has been clutching since childhood and takes a post by the gate with instructions that are clear and humble. Ring the bell when there is danger. Otherwise, let the courtyard fill with guests. You do not swear an oath of eternal fearlessness. You make a smaller, braver vow that can be renewed daily. I will not abandon myself. I will feel before I fix. I will tell the truth at a scale my body can bear. I will risk tiny losses of approval to end the grand loss of presence. I will move at the speed of trust, not the speed of panic. These promises do not make you invulnerable. They make you coherent. Coherence is better than invulnerability. It lets other people find you. The consequences of this pivot ripple beyond self-soothing. In relationships, you become locatable. You say, "I'm here," and mean it, because you are. Conflict ceases to be a referendum on your worth and becomes a negotiation between two dignities. You set a boundary and remain warm because a boundary is not a wall. It is a bridge with a weight limit posted so you don't collapse. You apologize without theatrics because guilt is an alarm, not a sentence. You forgive without erasing history because forgiveness is not amnesia. It is the decision to stop letting resentment draft your future. The room changes when you are in it because presence is contagious. The human nervous system mirrors regulation as surely as it mirrors panic. You do fewer heroic rescues and more everyday reliability. You stop auditioning and start collaborating. Work shifts from theater to craft. You produce not to prove, but to contribute. The difference is visible even to you. Anxiety no longer counterfeits purpose. Purpose becomes quiet and stubborn. A loyalty to value over velocity. You create original things because you can now afford the wandering that originality requires. You say no to projects that would be excellent but dishonest. You choose the good that is yours, which means refusing the very attractive goods that are not. You walk away from rooms that demand you abandon yourself at the coat check. You stay in difficult rooms where repair is possible because you can remain without dissolving. Courage becomes local and daily rather than spectacular and deferred. Spiritually, whether or not you use the word, the horizon tilts. Meaning is no longer a peak to conquer but a way of moving through the valley. You do not chase transcendence as an escape hatch. You practice immanence, the sacrament of the ordinary. Coffee becomes a ritual because you taste it. A walk becomes a prayer because you notice the weather inside and out. You discover that you were never trying to outrun a monster. You were trying to outrun a messenger whose letter you can finally open. It says what you feared and hoped in equal measure. You are already inside the life you kept trying to reach later. Later is a mirage created by a nervous system in flight. Now is not sentimental. It is specific, textured, inconvenient, and sufficient. Does this mean you stop improving? No. It means improvement is no longer a euphemism for self-rejection. You still learn new skills, expand capacities, repair harms, apologize and change. But the engine is different. Shame, once relied upon as a whip, retires from management and returns to its rightful scale, a signal that something matters. Fear steps down from the throne and joins the council. Joy, which you once distrusted because it threatened to slow you down, gets a portfolio in decision-making. Grief, which you once postponed indefinitely, becomes a seasonal guest whose visits keep you honest about what you've lost and what you love. The psyche ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a polity, noisy, plural, governable by care, and the world. You will still find it noisy, sometimes hostile, often absurd, but you stop treating its turbulence as a command to flee yourself. You stop outsourcing your rhythm to the market's pulse. You choose where to give your attention because you know attention is your life in miniature. You log off not to purify yourself, but to protect the fragile edge where perception grows porous to wonder. You log on with intention when you can contribute something that rings true. You become less certain and more honest, which is a trade the world needs. You locate your small agency within large systems and exercise it without theatrics, because the performance is no longer the point. Repair replaces performance as your mode. In the cinematic quiet at the end of this long chase, nothing explodes. You pay your bills, you answer emails more slowly, you return a message you would have dodged. You put your hand on your own chest when panic says run and you say, I'm here. You look at the closed wing of your museum and unlock a door, not all the doors at once, just one. Light moves across exhibits no one has seen in years. Dust dances. The air changes. You laugh at nothing, then cry at the same nothing, and you feel ridiculous and relieved. On the street, the morning is the same and entirely new. The man who stopped running does not ascend. He walks into his day with both feet, and because he is there, others find their way to themselves more easily. This is the final, most powerful realization, the one that rearranges the furniture of your mind. There was never a finish line outside you. There was only the invitation to belong to your own life, and let belonging guide your choices. Freedom is not the multiplication of exits. It is the decision to inhabit a room long enough to love what it contains and change what it demands. You have always held the key. The lock was your refusal to turn toward the door it fit. If this speaks to you, don't keep it private. Share this with the one person who will understand the runner you've been and the host you are becoming. Tell me in the comments what door you are ready to unlock and what vow you will carry into tomorrow. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep practicing together. Philosophy not as an abstract sport, psychology not as diagnosis alone, but as the art of becoming present. New lectures, guided practices, and conversations are on the way. Stay with us because a life is not discovered by sprinting toward it, but by the courage to stop and say, I'm here.